Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us for what is the eighth session in the Shoonya webinar series. Today, we bring together perspectives from across markets to better understand how zero pollution mobility is being scaled in practice. Today's discussion focuses on how emerging economies are approaching the EV transition through a mix of policy, financing, business models, and on-ground implementation. We'll be hearing from leaders across Southeast Asia and Africa and exploring how different markets are navigating similar challenges, often in a little different ways. That being said, here's what you can expect over the next hour. We'll begin with a short presentation to familiarize everyone with the Shoonya campaign, and then we'll dive right into the panel discussion featuring our panel of experts. So without further delay, allow me to take a quick moment to introduce the Shoonya campaign and the impact it's creating through its partner network. Shoonya was launched by the Government of India's premier policy think tank, Niti Aayog, in collaboration with RMI in September 2021 to accelerate zero pollution mobility in India with a specific focus on final mile deliveries and ride hailing. These segments were identified as early opportunities for electrification given their high daily usage and also relatively centralized operations. At its core, Shoonya's vision has been threefold. First, to build awareness and demand for zero pollution rides and deliveries among consumers. Second, to recognize and amplify industry efforts that are fast tracking India's EV transition. And then lastly, to help chart a credible pathway towards 100% electrification in these segments. If we could move to the next slide, Tanishka, please. And to deliver on this vision, Shoonya operates through three key pillars. One, corporate engagement, the second being resource toolkits, and the third being consumer awareness. On corporate engagement, the campaign has brought together over 250 partners, spanning delivery platforms, fleet operators, charging providers, financiers, OEMs, creating a strong industry backbone for action. And then also on resource toolkits, Shoonya has launched three practical tools. First one being the finance toolkit, which helps navigate EV lending options for consumers. Second being the EV calculator that helps compare cost and emissions. And lastly, the policy map that simplifies national and state EV policies and incentives available to the consumers. And finally, on consumer awareness, through our collaboration with Government of India's citizen engagement platform, which is MyGov, we have now reached over 25 million people. We've engaged over 250,000 people through engagement campaigns and hosting public activities, all in all to build sort of momentum for zero pollution transport. And together, these efforts have enabled over 1.3 billion zero pollution rides and deliveries, resulting in more than 15 billion rupees in fuel savings to date. With that, let me bring in our panelists for today, who bring a range of perspectives from across emerging economies. I'll take a moment to introduce them in alphabetical order. First on the panel, we have Annika Berlin. Annika is a program management officer at the United Nations Environment Program based in Nairobi, working with Sustainable Mobility UNEP. The United Nations Environment Program supports governments and cities globally on climate-aligned transport and sustainable mobility transitions. Annika leads UNEP's global work on electric two and three-wheelers and has been closely involved in setting up Africa's support and investment platform, which works with countries, cities, private sector stakeholders to accelerate EV adoption. Welcome to the panel, Annika. Next up, we have Jordan Sotoko. Jordan leads strategy and expansion at Eisen, a fintech platform that enables access to credit by connecting digital platforms, financial institutions, and operators. Eisen is actively working at the intersection of mobility and finance, supporting EV adoption in Southeast Asia through models that link demand, financing, and operations. Jordan's work focuses on scaling electric mobility deployments through partnerships and market expansions across the region. Welcome to the panel, Jordan. Next on the panel, we have Koi Alaba. Koi serves as the Director of Off-Grid Transaction Advisory at GreenMax Capital Group, an investment and advisory firm supporting clean energy and sustainable infrastructure projects across emerging markets. Koi brings over a decade of experience in project finance and transaction advisory with a focus on structuring and enabling investments in clean energy and energy access. This includes work across financial modeling, investment readiness, and market development. Welcome to the panel, Koi.
Thank you, Vaibhav.
Next up, we have Rivana Mizaya. Rivana is the Director of Digital and Sustainability at Grab Indonesia. Grab is a leading platform across Southeast Asia operating in mobility, deliveries, and financial services and plays a key role in shaping EV adoption through its network of drivers and fleet partners. At Grab, Rivana leads strategy and sustainability initiatives, including efforts on EV adoption and driver programs, bringing platform perspective on how demand and operations are driving the transition to electric mobility in the region. Welcome to the panel, Rivana. Next, we have Yvonne Palomar Castro. Yvonne serves on the board of director at the Philippines EV Community, a nonprofit organization working to advance electric mobility and support an inclusive EV ecosystem in the Philippines. Yvonne brings over a decade of experience across policy, industry, and sustainable transport, and has played a key role in shaping the country's EV ecosystem, including early work on electric jeepneys and contributions to the national EV policy development. Yvonne brings a strong perspective on how policy, market development, and ecosystem are coming together to support EV adoption in the Philippines. Welcome to the panel, Yvonne. And finally, I'd like to introduce our moderator for today, my colleague Samita Shiladar. Samita serves as the director of RMI's Global Transportation Practice, where she works to advance clean, efficient, and affordable mobility solutions across India and other global South regions. With that, over to you, Samita, to kick off our discussion for today.
Thank you so much, Vaibhav, and thank you to all of the panelists for joining us today for this discussion. I've had the pleasure of working with all of you in the past, and each of you brings such a grounded perspective on how EV transition is actually unfolding across different emerging economies. Before we get started, a quick welcome to all of our audience. We would love to make this interactive, so please share your questions or reflections through chat or Q&A function as we go along, and we'll save some time in the end to bring those questions into the discussion. To get some more context for today's discussion, as we all know, electric vehicle adoption is accelerating across emerging economies, and this is being driven by a mix of factors from energy independence and security to air quality concerns, climate goals, and increasingly stronger economics for vehicle owners as well. We are seeing this momentum play out across different segments. For example, in India, 2 and 3-wheelers, passenger vehicles, and freight vehicles are leading many markets, largely because the business case is already very compelling. But now this is also extending to cars, light commercial vehicles, and we also have started seeing kind of different types of pilots with respect to zero emission trucks. The drivers behind this, particularly in India, are becoming clear. It's strong policy support both on supply and demand side, growing pool of capital, infrastructure development, as well as increasing collaboration amongst corporate. At the same time, while the crux of this transition is similar, the stories across different emerging economies have their own nuances. For example, in Indonesia, the transition is closely linked to the critical minerals and industrial strategy. Or in Philippines, we are seeing a holistic roadmap and policy frameworks coming together through initiatives like CREVI. In Nigeria, there is a strong push through energy transition planning and innovative financing models, while in Kenya, policy clarity and business partnerships are really driving the adoption with respect to a lot of cases. Overall, from ojeks in Indonesia or trikes or jeepneys in Philippines, auto rickshaws in India, boda bodas in Kenya, and matatus broadly in East Africa, or kekes or danfos in West Africa, these everyday modes of transportation are really helping us understand what exactly is driving adoption with respect to EVs in multiple emerging economies. And that is really the spirit of our discussion here today, to explore what is working, what is not working, and how these different experiences can build upon each other and what can we all learn from each other. So with that, I would like to open today's discussion with a question for all of our panelists. If you could briefly share the sector or region that you have been working with, and in your market, what has been the single most important enabler with respect to EV adoption so far. Would love to get your thoughts from everyone. We'll start with Rivana. Over to you.
Hi, Samita and everybody. Thank you for the invitation. Very honored for us to be able to join this webinar and really being part of the movement in more than just in Southeast Asia about the EV, transition to EV. So Grab operates in Southeast Asia, and we just released our newest ESG report, where in 2025, actually 9% of the total distance traveled in Grab is actually on low emission or EV. So it's already an increase from the previous years. And being Indonesia itself, Grab operates the biggest EV fleet in the country with more than 14,000 units. And this year we are growing very aggressively as well. And obviously, it's not something that can be done by ourselves. It is when it comes to transition to EV, we believe it's a work of the whole ecosystem. So the orchestration of the ecosystem is very, very important, from the behavior of our drivers and consumers to the heavy duties, supplies and infrastructure development by the other players in the sector. But if your question is what has been the main enabler so far, I think that I cannot pinpoint to one, but really it's the ecosystem orchestration that where everybody plays its role to fulfill the gaps, whether it's infrastructure or public perception or behavior or financing. And once we really start to see the music playing, being orchestrated well, we see the traction going up right now.
Thank you. Thank you for sharing that perspective, Rowana. Annika, I want to pass the same question off to you. Any thoughts from UNEP perspective? You have been working a lot on Africa's EV transition as well as a lot on global EV transition broadly. What do you think has been the critical enabler?
Yeah, thanks, Samita. Thanks for inviting us to be here. And as you said, of course, as UNEP, we work globally. So right now we're supporting about 60 countries across Asia, Latin America, and Africa with the transition to e-mobility. Not only twin three-wheelers, so all different types of mode of transport, but twin three-wheelers, of course, as being a very dominant mode in many of the countries and used by low middle income groups and also for popular transport. It's been a key part of our portfolio. I personally have mainly worked on our African portfolio, and I think also, as Ivana said, there's not really one single factor, but I think the most important one, which you also mentioned in your introduction, is economics. So it will only scale if the economics work out, and that, of course, depends then on the difference between the price of petrol and the price of electricity, and also the affordability of the vehicle. So is there access to financing to cover the upfront cost differential between electric and petrol motorcycles? And that we see, for example, more uptake in East Africa because of the asset financing ecosystem, where it's much easier to get consumer credit, though at high interest rates, but it is available. In markets where we see there's more of a formal sector in financing, where they're more risk averse and there's no financing for electric vehicles, there's a slower uptake. And the other one is, of course, also then the second factor is the electricity availability, but also is it locally generated renewable electricity or is it imported electricity? Again, a factor that explains, I think, the higher uptake in East Africa versus now West Africa. I think the third factor is local assembly versus manufacturing versus incumbent industries. So markets where there is actually no automotive industry, we see a higher uptake because of new startups coming in and tapping into the market and pushing the job creation agenda, which is something that then, now to the fourth point, goes to the politicians. So the politicians want to hear job creation. And that's something that now with the new startups, I think you can definitely see. And that comes then to the aspect of policies. So are the enabling policies there? And that's everybody talks first about all the fiscal incentives and tax exemptions and whatnot. But I think in the end, it's also about enabling local industry to scale and to develop, and also not putting in place barriers, but rather the enabling policies such as, for example, standards around safety. Like everybody talks always about interoperability, but I think first of all, you need a baseline to ensure that it's a safe product that you can trust. Because if someone depends on their motorcycle for their life or livelihoods, then you want to make sure that they want to be sure that the vehicle is going to last them, and not just for a few months, and then they have to get a new one. And I think the last aspect I just want to mention is the informal sector integration. So looking into many of these operators operate in informal environments where, again, access to finance might not be there, where maybe education is not there, financial literacy could be an issue. So I think looking into how we can better integrate the sector into the public transport system is important to scale adoption, and part of these delivery platform work, I think, is one of that, where we make the delivery sector more formal, more integrated into the system, helping them to electrify.
Thanks for sharing that perspective, Annika. I want to pass it to Koe since Annika also touched on the financing aspect, and particularly in Nigeria, the equation between the subsidies with respect to fuel versus subsidies with respect to electricity have been especially interesting. So, Koe, if you could speak a little bit about Nigeria's EV ecosystem, and in your opinion, what has been what have been the critical factors that are driving EV adoption? If you could share your thoughts on that.
Thank you, Samita. And thanks for the invite. And hi, everyone. Greetings from Nigeria. Um, so I'm gonna echo Annika. The If I could pinpoint one major factor, it's definitely the economics. The single most important fundamental enabler of EV adoption in Nigeria, particularly, has been cost savings, and the fastest level of growth is being recorded in the two-wheeler, three-wheeler market segment, particularly in commercial use cases. Um, Motorcycle taxis, tricycles, used for ride hailing, delivery, electric motorcycles, delivery, electric bicycles, mini buses, and so on. And that's, it's very intuitive because this high mileage commercial use cases typically require high fuel consumption and maintenance. So it makes the switch to EVs very compelling. So to provide more color on this, so Greenmax, we are an advisory firm, fund management firm focused on the clean energy space, and we provide consulting services, preparing knowledge products, and also advising a number of mobility companies across sub-Saharan Africa, and we've also developed a number of facilities to support the mobility market. So to buttress what I was saying, we conducted a study in 2024 under a program called Get Invest Market Insights, and we did a comparison between, comparing the total cost of ownership of an electric motorcycle and a combustion engine motorcycle for a commercial use case, 100 kilometer per day utilization. And our analysis showed that due to fuel and maintenance cost savings, switching to an electric motorcycle results in cost savings of about 25%. And this was 2 years ago when the price of petrol in Nigeria was 650 naira. Today, the price of petrol is double that amount, and the exchange rate is about the same as at the time we did the study. So even as of today, the savings is perhaps even double, right? So it makes the case for EVs compelling, and so the adoption in Nigeria, particularly, is not due to climate sentiment, but cash flow, economics logic. So, and of course, like Annika also said, this has been enabled by, um, financing models, innovative financing models, the battery as a service, lease to own, which removes the high upfront cost barriers and enables these riders to be able to afford to acquire the electric motorcycles and three-wheelers. Thank you. Let me just stop there. Thank you.
Well, thanks for sharing that perspective, Kwe. I want to pass it off to Yvonne just to hear her perspective from Philippines perspective as part of the Philippine CV community.
Hi. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm currently in Manila, very hot in here today. But yes, I agree with the rest of the speakers. It still is the affordability, really, of the electric vehicles that will drive the shift. I've been working in this space since, I don't know, 2007, way before, everything was talking about EV and the relevance into it, with the introduction of few units that we piloted for electric jeepney. And then I moved on into the development of the electric tricycles that was funded by the ADB through the Department of Energy. So that was in 2016. And it was at that time that we were trying to make the public transport understand the value of the vehicles. But how can you sell it when it's like times 5? Like it's selling at 500,000 pesos. That's 500,000. and then the regular tricycle will only cost them 100,000. And so, the uptake was really very slow, but this was more than a decade ago. But the transition at that time was through the proof of concept. After like a half a year, when those first takers were able to see, and it's anecdotal, they tell the other drivers, I'm making more money, I'm paying the amortization very well and everything. And so that project is a success. And if you're familiar with the Boracay Island in the Philippines, very famous, the transition of the whole island through the electric vehicle for the public transportation space, the e-trike. That's the project that I started way back in 2014, and now it still is running and operating. And now you cannot bring in any ICE in the island except electric. And so, yes, the proof of concept is good, but it's always be the bottom line of the economics, the affordability, and how much are the people bringing into the table every day after everything else, and the rest will follow, like a GHG reduction, a better sense of health and wellness to the public drivers. But those are like secondary and tertiary consideration.
Well, thanks for sharing that. And thank you also for touching on the topics with respect to informal transit modes such as jeepney or trikes. I want to pass it to Jordan just to hear his perspective, since you work so much with corporates and some of these more formalized sectors of ride-hailing deliveries. What is your perspective on the EV sector in Indonesia?
Yes, thank you, Samita. Pleasure to be here. And I think great answers from all of the panelists. And I think I'm just going to repeat some of the points that have been made. Yes, I think it is important regarding orchestrating the ecosystem, because that's what we do at Aizen. So I'd like to consider our work to be important, of course. But I think the biggest caveat is the visible economics, as mentioned. I think this is important because in emerging markets, the biggest challenge is not just whether the EV is cheaper on paper. The challenge is whether the ecosystem around the asset is reliable enough for financing. And I think it shows in Indonesia specifically, because when you see like four-wheelers, like, for example, we have brands who come from China, let's say, and they already have like reputable brands, and they have the capital to aggressively scale their infrastructure, their after sales, and that creates a structured safety net for financing, right? But that's why the growth of four-wheeler EVs in Indonesia is doing fine. But that doesn't happen with the two-wheelers, right? It's quite lagging. That's because there's a lot of more startups rather than established brands, OEMs, and that's the risk. And I think lenders need confidence that the vehicle will be used, that the users can pay, that maintenance is available, that downtime is manageable, and there's some view on residual value, right? When this ecosystem established, it gives a better sense of for financiers to deploy their funds, right? So I think the enabler is not only policy or technology, it's bankable demand. When platforms, operators, OEMs, charging providers, and financing partners are all aligned around a specific use case, and EV adoption will become much easier to scale.
No, thanks. Thank you for sharing that. I want to pass it off to Rivana just to get her thoughts on what Jordan also mentioned in terms of bankability. As Grab, you're one of the biggest kind of end user with respect to electric vehicles, with respect to ride-hailing delivery sector in Southeast Asia, and you're really at an intersection of consumer demand, driver preference, as well as fleet operations, directly interacting with financiers as well, which really gives you like a unique view into what is actually driving EV uptake. So, from your experience across Southeast Asia, what are the drivers and consumers valuing the most when it comes to considering electric vehicles, and what factors have been most effective so far in influencing the decisions with respect to drivers uptaking more and more EVs? If you could share your experience so far on that.
Yeah, okay. So I think for us in the beginning, so I think Grab started to include EV in the fleet strategy started in 2019. So since that time, we know like what we needed to do the first time is to ensure that the drivers want to use it, right? And it actually has a value added factors for the drivers to actually ride with EVs. And for us, it's a lot of it is behavioral. So at the time, obviously, the Indonesian market in EV is not as robust as right now. So at that time, we had a choice whether we wanted to be, we want to start first, or we just wait for the market to be mature, and then we just adopt all of these EV owners into the ride-hailing platforms, right? At the time, the decision was actually to invest ourselves first and then introduce the EVs to the drivers to prove that first, you can actually do ride-hailing, food delivery with EV, because they have a different usage than any other individual user of EV. They travel around 300 kilometers per day, and we need to really prove that it's doable with EV. And then, like what the other panelists say, we need to also prove to them that the cost of operations is actually cheaper when you use EV. And during the transition, we are there. We help you with the maintenance. We help you with any trainings necessary, any questions. And also we introduce the fleet to the customer as well, right? Majority of Grab customers actually stated that they want to contribute to the environment, and having an EV taxi type and in EV drivers deliver their food, for example, is something that they want as well. So all of this is designed, skewed really to establish the behavior first, the belief from the driver's side that you can still do your job well with more value added with EV. After that is about orchestrating the other part of the ecosystem where Pak Jordan is part of as well. So investing first, build the behavior for us, and then we see if we can really scale this up together with the other players as well.
No, thank you for sharing that. I want to also get Annika's perspective from Africa's side of things. Consumer awareness campaigns broadly are also playing a lot of meaningful role in terms of electric vehicle adoption, especially in terms of building trust, shifting perceptions, and just making EVs feel more and more relevant for everyday use, not just among the customers, but also amongst the drivers. How has your experience been so far in terms of looking at different countries in Africa with respect to an effective approach in terms of the messaging channels, target audience? I know there are lots of campaigns that are also going on in Kenya. If you could speak a little bit to what is driving adoption in the African countries, especially from the driver perspective.
Yeah, thanks, Amita. Actually, that's not something we directly work on as the UN. So our main audience is policymakers, not so much the final customers, because I think there are many other organizations doing a better job there. You know, the private sector, the startups, and sort of the other ecosystem players on like the consumer side, because I don't think it's like the role of the UN to promote certain products. But of course, indirectly, we are involved in these campaigns because we've also initially, I think our first electric two-wheeler pilot was in 2019 in Kenya. Back then, it was one of the first electric vehicles. So there was a lot of messaging also to go on. But I think it's also important to convince policymakers and other ecosystem players that this transition is necessary, because as I mentioned before, and as some people said, they need to provide the enabling framework for companies and then consumers to adopt electric vehicles. So I think one is in terms of messaging, I would say, don't say it's going to reduce CO2 emissions because that's a sort of very foreign concept, and also maybe not at the most urgent need for many people. So I think really talking about the economic aspects, the low operational cost, the local production. I think many people are also happy to support made in Kenya, made in India, made in Rwanda, more than imported from Japan, or, you know, not like picking any country, but in general, I think there's sort of local proud in the product, I think is very important in terms of why we're adopting it. I think air pollution is a big one, where though it's still a bit it's not so visible depending on where you are, but it's definitely, I think, another aspect that's important to say. And then in terms of channels, I think there it has to really be depending on the local context. Like every country has sort of different types of social media they use. I think WhatsApp is, of course, a channel that many use, but then there are others. So I think using the channels that people that should adopt the technology use is important to look at. And also, I think in person, so like showing, like we had an e-mobility pilot project in Sierra Leone with electric three-wheelers, but they had never seen an electric vehicle before because there are just none. So how can you go now and say about, okay, what do you think about electric three-wheelers? Well, you need to bring them there first, have touch points, have them test them, see the battery, touch it, realize it's not going to explode, it's nothing super crazy. So I think that's the third aspect. And I think in terms of audiences, being targeted is important. So not go, okay, that general public, everybody has to know. I think starting with like high users, because you want to reduce emissions, you want to show the operational cost savings. So I think also what Shoonya is doing, going into the delivery sector, going into the public transport drivers. So targeting the segment that's most important to adopt these vehicles and that are mostly going to benefit from them, and then it's going to spread. And also, if you have motor taxis being electric, more people are being exposed to them because they're the passengers as well. So more so than if a private person adopts an electric two-wheeler, it's only that private person and maybe the family that's going to experience the benefits. But if it's a taxi or delivery, then many more people are going to experience the benefits of an electric vehicle. So I think, and also showing it's a reliable product, because you're not going to use it to deliver stuff or to deliver people if it's not a reliable and safe product. Whereas for like maybe some individuals who would say they're testing new technologies, it doesn't really prove that it's a valid concept that can be scaled up to universal applicability at one point.
No, makes sense. Thanks for sharing that. I have a follow-up question for Yvonne, just based on this topic. Could you speak a little bit about informal or semi-formal modes of transportation broadly? Basically, systems such as jeepneys or trikes are one of the important modes of transportation. If you could speak to different policy measures or different kind of financing measures that have been supporting the growth of these particular sectors in Philippines, that would be really amazing.
Okay. Yeah, but I don't want to use the word informal because they're very much regulated in my country. So, for example, the three-wheelers, the first they're actually where the government is looking at. We have more than 1 million of these three-wheelers in the country, and the shift could have been, something that's easy to replicate. But I think during at that time, 2012, 2014 was too early for the government to understand really the technology and the deployment process that needs to be done for it to be successful. And so they stopped to the pilot point only. But yes, there are regulations in place. They're part of the broader law, which is the Electric Vehicle Industry Development Act. They're covered under that. They're covered under the incentives as well, like the zero tariff, the tax-free importation, and any other benefits, because they're, as long as they're battery driven, then they whatever is stated in the law, whatever the policies are. But from the high level policies right now, the government is really more focused on the four wheels. As you well know, we are not a manufacturing country, and so we're trying to bring in, at this stage, we're importing almost all our passenger car vehicles. So with that, I think the brilliant thing that the government do just to introduce that the technology is not something to be fearful of, was to reduce the tax up to a certain point. I think up till 2030, we're like getting zero tariff and zero importation for all the electric vehicles that are coming into country. And then next to that, the strategy of the government really is to develop manufacturing, but probably not in that head-to-head with, the Chinese car brands or, the Japanese, but more focusing on like the commercial vehicles or the last mile vehicles that can be manufactured here in the country, where we have expertise in bodybuilding, and also in trying. It's easier for us to understand how to maintain this, to make in the public transportation space, we know already what needs to be done. And so with the government right now, we have as part of the law a big budgeted incentive strategy in the manufacturing sector, and we're hoping that this program by the country can be started by next year, with all this energy problems that we have globally, might be, but we are highly impacted because we're 98% importing our fuel sources. So I think from the policy perspective, it covers all range of public transportation. But for now, the goal of the government is to showcase, and by importing all of these four-wheel vehicles as passenger car vehicles, it shows that the technology is working. And then the rest maybe will follow, hopefully.
Yeah, no, thank you for sharing that perspective also from the import side of things and just broadly different public modes of transportation side of things. Complementary to that is a lot of financing solutions that really have been driving the electric vehicle market. And Koy, Jordan, both of you are working on different sides of the financing equation in Africa and in Southeast Asia. So I'm curious to get both of your thoughts in terms of how different financing structures are enabling EV adoption. I know both of you are also working on different types of tri-party agreements, different types of collaborations between stakeholders that are really distributing the risks associated with EVs. So curious to get your thoughts in terms of what exactly is enabling these partnerships across different companies. So we'll start with you, Koe, if you can share your experience in terms of different financing models or business models driving EV adoption in Nigeria. And then I would also love to get Jordan's views in terms of how that is working out in Indonesia as well.
Okay, thank you. I think the financing models that have proven most effective in Nigeria and other African markets is um, lease to own, pay-go financing, asset financing types of solutions. And of course, this is because it solves the affordability problem where it lowers the upfront cost per range and enables um, two-wheeler, three-wheeler taxi operators to be able to afford the electric vehicles. Yeah, so but the part of the challenge that we have seen is that most of these users typically do not have sufficient credit history. So there's a lot of perceived risk on the side of the financiers to finance this segment and these assets. There's also utilization risk and so on. So one of the ways that we have um, tried to solve that problem is by developing a facility called Green for Access, Fresh Loss Facility. And so our facility provides first loss coverage up to 20% to local financial institutions to support them to lend to customers of clean energy companies, e-mobility companies, right? So currently, we are working with Fortune Credit in Kenya, and Fortune Credit is then, with the support of our first loss facility, um, they are providing lease-to-own financing to customers of Iwaka, Rome, um, and Zeno. Um, so, so this solution enables, the acquisition of electric motorcycles, electric bicycles for delivery, for ride-hailing purposes. We're also working with EV Moja, and they're financing four-wheelers like for cab drivers and ride-hailing platforms. So far, our facility has supported the financing of over 550 electric vehicles. We started just a couple of years ago, and the facility is, backed by a blended finance structure. So I would also like to buttress the fact that um, blended finance models are also very critical in the sector. So the Green for Access facility blends grant funding from donors with concessional loans from um, development finance institutions to then extend a cash reserve to the financial institutions, local financial institutions, to enable them to lend. It provides a stronger risk mitigation facility or solution compared to the existing pari passu guarantees. So these are some of the um, financing models that we've seen that have been very um, useful in the market. Thank you.
And thanks for sharing that, Koy. Jordan, over to you to share your perspective on Indonesia's market. If you see any similar themes emerging with what Koy also shared in terms of how things are working in Nigeria.
Yeah, so I think um, like for us in Aizen, we try to build a model which involves every party, every stakeholders in the ecosystem. And some people say this is the tripartite model. So, and I think the way we think about it is that EV deployment requires three things to come together and collaborate at the same time. And those three are demand, operations, and financing. I think Aizen's role is to structure the bridge between those parties. We work with platforms to understand the use case. For example, we work closely with Grab, and we have deployed thousands of bikes with them. And we always try to understand their expected utilization, operating area, driver profile, vehicle requirements, and so on. Then we work with the OEMs and the charging partners to ensure that the product and infrastructure can actually support that use case. And finally, we help structure the financing so the operator is not treated as an isolated borrower, but more so as we'd say as a project of a contracted operating ecosystem in which we became the asset holders. So I think these kind of like contracts is important because it reduces one of the biggest questions for lenders. Will this asset generate predictable revenue? Right. So without this, a lender is financing a relatively new asset class with uncertain resale value and limited historical data. And with this kind of like agreement, there is more visibility on utilization, income potential, repayment source, and operating continuity. I'd have to admit that it does not remove all risk, but it makes the risk easier to understand and allocate for the financiers. And I think these financial models aims to do one thing. That's to reduce risk, right? And risk comes from incomplete data and a lack of structure. And that's what this model is trying to fix.
Thanks for sharing that, Jordan. I have so many follow-up questions for everyone, but I'm also seeing many questions in the audience. So I'm going to take some of those and include it as part of the questions that I already had. Next one, I want to come back to you, Annika, just to speak a little bit about harmonization associated with policies. In particular, as part of building upon your work with UNEP across different countries in Africa, different countries are starting from very different baselines. Even just now, when we are speaking as part of this panel itself, the fuel prices, grid reliability, import structures, or regulatory environments are all shaping the pace and pathway of this transition. Do you see more and more opportunities for greater harmonization across different countries when it comes to EV transition? And especially, there have been a lot of questions associated with charging protocol or standardization. If you could share any of your thoughts on policy harmonization and standardization both.
Yeah, thanks for the question, Samit. I think that's a topic that always comes up. And I think what I've now learned also over the last couple of years working in this space is that it doesn't really follow a sequence. Like ideally, you would think, okay, you set the standards and then everybody adopts them. First, a country adopts them, then the region, then the world, and then we're all good. But I feel like in reality, it's more like a bottom-up approach where there's a lot of testing and prototyping and different products for different markets. And then organically, some sort of a standard evolves. And then I think once we get to a bit more scale, that's then where it will have to be taken up to a regional harmonization level, which is something that at UNEP we are pursuing. For example, we're working with the East African community, with the ECOWAS, the West African community, and even the Southern African ones, and also with ASEAN, to now develop some sort of guidelines looking into best practices of what have different countries now adopted or are adopting in terms of, like, for example, the national standard bureaus. First, we look at the safety aspects, the quality aspects, and then later on, I think the interoperability in terms of when we talk about battery swapping, that different batteries can fit different products. I think that's sort of the step. And then same with if you talk about plug-in charging, the connectors and the charging protocols. But I think that it's really to look, first of all, what is most applicable in the different countries, and then bringing it to the sub-regions to then disseminate knowledge. And I think in the meantime, before we now have a fixed regulatory framework, it's a lot about sharing experiences and knowledge. For example, we are hosting the Africa E-Mobility Forum every year, where we get policymakers from different countries to talk to private sector from different countries, again, to also better understand the technology and what are really the needs for standardization, because we don't need to standardize if there's no need for it. And also what are the priorities. So I think creating these dialogue platforms is very important between public and private sector, but also like between different public sector, like horizontal discussions. Also then now with e-mobility, we're talking not only about standards in the transport sector, we're talking about the energy sector, we're talking about Ministry of Industries in terms of automotive assembly, homologation of vehicles, charging, it will be the energy regulators. It's also about harmonization of tariffs, which is then the Energy Petroleum Regulatory Authority. So really bringing these different players on board to better understand what is needed for a certain market. And then if relevant, and I think it is mostly relevant in similar regions, then to create these guidelines on a sub-region level. We have, for example, also worked with GIZ and other entities in ASEAN on the guidelines for light electric vehicle standards, because of course many of these vehicles are sort of new products that haven't existed before, so there are no standards in some sense. I think it's very important to look into that, but then again, don't come from a top-down approach, but rather really bottom up, and see also, I think also the link with the other colleagues on the financing side, like what do financiers need in terms of to de-risk the investment in terms of standards and harmonization to ensure that the investments will be profitable in the future. So I think having these sort of coordinated dialogues is very important.
No, thanks for sharing that, Annika. I want to kind of just double down on the topic that you shared with respect to the vehicle availability, the product. My next question is to Annika. My next question is to Ravana. There are lots of questions already in the chat which are related to how the companies are asset light or working on broad platform with respect to ride hailing or deliveries and financial support, and how does that tie broadly with respect to the quality of the asset itself. I'm curious to hear your perspective on what exactly companies like Grab are looking for when it comes to a reliable electric vehicle, especially because it eventually then ties to a lot of things with respect to the harmonization with respect to standards, or even a good financing mobilization in the entire ecosystem.
Yeah, I think it's for the units itself, for the EV vehicle itself, definitely it has to be able to cater to the needs of ride hailing and food delivery drivers, which means it'll be like exponentially more use than a typical personal, just like point-to-point user of EV vehicle, right? So that's what we tested with. That's why we've always been OEM agnostic. We are not exclusive with any of the brands. We want to try and test and pilot any brands that come to us, and we see how they can actually cater and serve our driver partners, because for them, literally, time is money. So if the vehicle broke down, if the charging is not available on time, if the battery swap is taking a long time or not available units, then it'll cost them money. And at the end of the day, their loyalty to the platform as well, right? So that's always been our North Star, is whether or not they can cater to a specific ride-hailing usage. And when we also partner with the other players in the ecosystem, under the umbrella of orchestration, like for example, the charging infrastructures, a lot of questions here relating to the charging infrastructures. We have decided we're not going to be a player in a charging infrastructure, but we choose to partner, again, agnostically, because we also want to see the quality and also whether they can work with us in predicting where the demands are in which specific time or period of time. So it's always like testing whether or not our ride-hailing drivers can still deliver their service at the quality that is needed for them to sustain their livelihood as well. So that's the focus, I think, in trying to see who to work with and all that. And in terms of like light asset or heavy asset, so we have both models in our company, and we also have both models where Grab actually provides the vehicles where the drivers can rent with us, or we also accept the marketplace platform where people are already using EV come to us and drive under our EV taxi type that we offer to our customer in a more premium rate.
Thanks, Rana. I want to double down again on the charging infrastructure topic, but I want to pass it off to Koe. There are some questions in terms of just charging standardization and also charging versus swapping. If you could share any of your thoughts in terms of how charging versus swapping conversation is going on in Nigeria or rest of the parts of West Africa, and just share any thoughts in terms of how does charging or swapping infrastructure and eventually grid infrastructure relates to how widespread the network is. I think that would really help and answer a lot of questions that we are already seeing in the chat.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, I mean, charging infrastructure is particularly critical, and it's also the major bottleneck really that we're seeing because it's sort of the hardest part of the piece of the puzzle to finance, right? So there's a lot of financing available for the the bikes, the motorcycles, and so on, in terms of asset financing, but the um, patient capital needed for the charging infrastructure um, is still largely not available at the levels required. But we are seeing, that, for instance, in rural areas, we've seen collaborations between energy providers and e-mobility companies. So solar mini grid companies collaborating with EV operators. So the solar mini grid is charging the electric motorcycles, and even in um, the urban areas as well, right? So interplay between solar companies and electric vehicle operators would continue to be important to continue to scale the market in markets where there's still the question of electricity availability, electricity supply. Yeah, so but in terms of interoperability, that's, I think, something that um, it's still been fashioned out in terms of policy and standardization, like Annika also touched on. There's the African Continental Free Trade Agreement that seeks to standardize EV standards across 55 countries in Africa, but that's still an initiative that's ongoing. Um, so these are just some thoughts on standardization, interoperability, and charging infrastructure. Thank you.
Thank you, Koy. My next question is to Yvonne. There are multiple questions that are there in terms of just broad national emergency with respect to the entire energy security. If you could just share, you already touched upon that topic a little bit, but if you could share more thoughts on it. And then there is also a lot of work that needs to be done with respect to after sales service, especially with respect to electric vehicles. So if you could also share some of the work or some of the work that is already happening in Philippines, especially with respect to driver readiness or training, and how does that affect broad fleet uptake?
Okay, so we're in a very unique condition right now because we have a national state of emergency in the energy sector. And that means that it's not just the Department of Energy or the Department of Trade that are working and monitoring all of these things that are happening in the transportation space. The first thing that the government usually does when in this is, to give subsidy to the public transport operators. But now they're trying to channel some of these resources that will be available because of the state of emergency more on the side of how can we make this like as a longer impact in terms of our strategy for fleet transition in the public sector and also for the ownership for the private owners. And so one of those things that happened is like, for example, just a few days ago, the Department of Trade and Industry gave like around 3 million pesos loan facility for the ride hailing operators and drivers who wanted to transition into full electric. So that's one of the initiatives. It's just very, very fast when it comes into coming into the market. And of course, we're talking about, okay, so when we talk about after sales, I think from the experience right now, we have like a new law that only anchored everything about electric in the country in 2022. And then in 2023, one of the biggest conglomerates in the country where I'm currently working entered into the e-mobility space. And within a span of 2 years, this company, our company where I'm working, already have 80 dealerships, the biggest in the country. So wherever you go in the Philippines, I think it brings more comfort into the buyers of the vehicle that we are selling, that yes, there's no problem in terms of ownership.
Thanks for sharing that, Yvonne. I think one of the common themes that is definitely appearing in terms of what everyone is saying is just more and more coordination across different types of stakeholders, from OEMs or end users, charging infrastructure providers, not just during the sales of electric vehicles, but even after. Jordan, as a fleet operator, financier, kind of sitting at the center of this ecosystem, what do you think really makes these partnership work in practice, or what are some of the best practices with respect to collaboration across stakeholders that you have been seeing?
Yeah, so we are acting as an ecosystem coordinator and also as an asset manager. And I think that matters because EV deployment is not a one-party execution problem, right? It depends on whether every stakeholder can deliver their part consistently. And we work with every stakeholders, like OEMs and clients. And for example, with OEMs, the discussion cannot stop at just like, for example, the vehicle price. We need to understand like warranty coverage, spare part availability, maintenance costs, service SLA, towing, replacement, and so on. And I think for commercial fleets, downtime directly affects income, right? So after sales capability is as important as the vehicle itself. We have our team, like for example, sits on the OEM's workshop, right? And that's the same case with like our clients as well. We have our teams like sitting on like Grab's warehouse. So for example, with these operators, the focus is on understanding the adoption readiness. Like, are drivers comfortable using the vehicle? Does the range fit their routes? Is charging or swapping convenient? Does the pricing still allow them to earn enough? So understanding this economics is important because if it doesn't work, deployment will not scale, even if the technology or the product is good. And also, what makes this partnership work is being very specific before scaling. And that's why I mentioned that we actually work very closely with our partners and our clients. We try to clarify the economics, responsibilities, and failure points upfront. Uh, it goes as granular as who pays for maintenance outside warranty, right? What happens when a unit is down? How would the battery issues handle? And whether there would be like crimes, right? Maybe like traffic violation or even like theft. So who's going to be responsible for that? So even to that kind of like granular items, we have to clarify with our clients and our partners. I think the biggest lesson is that EV partnerships work when every party is aligned around these kind of like contexts, like utilization, uptime, and maintenance, and so on. If the vehicle is used productively, the driver earns and the platform gets applied, right? The OEM gets volume as well, and the financier gets repayment. So that's kind of like the closed loop system that we're trying to build. And we try to maintain that by working very closely and making sure that the communications is very clear between each of the stakeholders. So for us, coordination is about making sure that the ecosystem is designed daily operations, not just for like commercials at a high level.
And thanks for sharing that, Jordan. We are almost at top of the hour here, so I just want to have one last quick checkout question. If in one sentence, if all of the panelists could share from your experience, what has been one approach from your market that could be applied to other emerging economies, or one approach from other markets that you think could be relevant for your own, just based on the discussion today? What is that one best practice that you're taking away with you? Would love to hear all of your thoughts. We'll start with Ravana.
Okay. So maybe for us, always the core of it is collaboration. So we have to have enough humility to actually wanna collaborate and say that what we don't know, but we have to have the hunger to actually want to change the trajectory of something that previously maybe we think it wasn't impossible, or the market not ready and everything. So a combination of those and having the right partners to collaborate with is very important for us. And maybe one more thing that I haven't mentioned in the discussion is, in doing the change and the transition, we also make a point not to forget marginalized groups that actually gave us a lot of surprising results in terms of pursuing the change. For example, women have been early adopter and top adopters in the EV sector for us. And if we see like the productivity is very good, and they built their own communities to further transition. So I think it's nice if we keep testing, we get like some nice surprises like that as well.
Thank you for touching about that, Joanna. Annika, what are your thoughts?
Yeah, there's always never just one answer, of course, but I think in general that design with the user in mind. So really making sure that the product works. So both in terms of it meets the demand of the use case. It also is adapted to the local climate, to the traditions, to what other vehicles are around there. So I think really we have seen a lot of iteration in many of the African countries I've worked on in terms of piloting, like iterations in terms of product design, with the user in mind. And also I'm happy down the topic of gender was mentioned. How can we design a product that works for everyone? And also maybe is better than the other product that we had before. I think really trying to be ambitious in that sense, test it with a wide audience, and then get the ecosystem in place, work with the financiers, work with the platforms, work with the policymakers, the governments, to ensure that the enabling conditions are there. And I think if there's a good product and people are willing and there's partnerships, I'm very optimistic that we can reach scale quite fast.
Thanks for sharing that, Annika. Koi, what are your thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, similar to what the other two speakers have said, I think I would focus more on in an ecosystem, like Jordan emphasized, and I think that's something that will be very critical in the growth of the EV space. Having robust ecosystem where all the different stakeholders are working together and collaborating, it would end up reducing pricing and ensure that risks are properly allocated to the right parties. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Yvonne, over to you for your thoughts.
I think if there's just one word to describe everything that I've experienced the last 20 years, is that I have to be very, very patient, you know? So it means that whenever you're facing with whoever's the stakeholder, maybe the government, the private sector, you know, your ordinary consumer, you have to be patient with them and trying to make them understand the value of this technology. And at the end of the day, let me not forget that the source of energy, meaning it should be always, the bottom line is we should also push simultaneously with the technology, the renewable aspect, and you know, and then that I think will make everything holistic for everyone.
Thank you so much, Yvonne, on touching upon the EV grid integration aspect as well. Jordan, your closing thoughts.
Yeah, I think for EVs, especially in emerging markets, the product and the infrastructure has always been like a chicken and egg situation, right? And I think in terms of finance, we cannot just see it as isolated assets. We need to see EV as an operating ecosystem. And I think that means connecting every aspect, which is the product itself, the infrastructure, and also like the life cycle of the every part of the vehicle. Right? For example, in Eisen, we also do battery financing because we see that it's not only about the vehicle, but the battery networks like the BSS and also the charging providers. And not to forget, batteries can also have a second life usage. And how do we finance that? How do we plan to actually lengthen the useful economic life of the batteries? So I think from a finance standpoint, we need to look at it as an ecosystem rather than just like a product.
Thank you. Thank you so much for sharing that. And thank you to all of our panelists for sharing your insights, thoughts, experiences so candidly. This has been a very enriching discussion with all of your perspectives spanning from collaboration, policy, financing, different platforms on the ground implementation, and also touching upon topics such as inclusivity and collaboration that really enables it. And thank you to all of the audience who has joined us from different parts of the world and contributed through your questions and reflections. There is definitely a lot of momentum and a lot of work that needs to happen across emerging markets. And just as importantly, there is a strong opportunity for collaboration and sharing lessons. With that, we'll close the session. And again, thank you very much. Have a great rest of your day.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.